The news spread like wildfire through the sultry air of the southern city. The master of the Bellemere plantations was dead. His passing left behind a void larger than his shadow, a fortune built on endless fields of cotton, the toil of 1,000 enslaved souls, and the silence of those who could not speak their pain aloud. He had been one of the richest men in the region, a symbol of power and excess, who rarely dirtied his hands but grew wealthier with each harvest. Now he was gone, and all that remained was his widow, Margaret Bellemere. The city's whispers carried her name like perfume and poison alike. A woman of striking beauty and poise, she now stood at the centre of an empire she had never truly ruled. At the funeral she wore her mourning with grace, black veil, gloved hands, lips trembling with the perfect amount of grief. But behind that veil something else was stirring, something quiet and dangerous. The other elite gentlemen of the South observed her not merely with sympathy but with calculation. She was young, desirable, and immensely wealthy. A widow like her did not remain alone for long, not in this world of power and marriage contracts disguised as love. Yet Margaret had no interest in returning to the cage she had just escaped. The death of her husband had done more than leave her with property. It had given her the rarest gift a woman could have in that time: control. She no longer had to answer to anyone, no husband to obey, no patriarch to shadow her every move. For the first time in her life she could make decisions of her own. The thought of it both thrilled and terrified her. A week after the funeral she visited the plantations herself. It was her first time stepping onto those fields, not as a guest, but as the mistress in command. The air was thick with heat and the smell of earth. Overseers lined up respectfully, their hats in hand, eyes sharp with curiosity. The enslaved workers stood in rows, their bodies glistening with sweat, their faces unreadable. Margaret watched them work, how their hands moved through the cotton, how their backs bent under the weight of labour, how their silence carried a kind of strength she had never seen before. Her late husband had always described them as property, faceless labourers, but in that moment she saw something entirely different: power. That night she did not sleep. Her mind replayed the image of those men, their movements, their strength, their quiet defiance. It was an image that unsettled her, and yet deep down ignited a strange curiosity. The next morning she left her mansion and went to the slave market in the city. When asked what she was looking for, she simply replied, "House servants, young and strong." By evening she had purchased 10 men. Her overseers assumed they were for work around the estate. They were wrong. History often speaks of the Southern lady as a fragile creature, delicate, moral, incapable of cruelty. But the truth, as written by historians like Catherine Clinton and Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, tells a different story. Many white women, especially widows left to rule vast estates, discovered a dark kind of independence in their new roles. No longer bound by their husbands, they found themselves surrounded by power they had never wielded before. Power over land, over money, and over the bodies of the enslaved men who served them. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's estate became a place of quiet speculation. Servants noticed changes in her behaviour, how she would walk the halls alone at night, how she kept her new slaves housed close to the main quarters instead of in the fields. Candlelight flickered late into the night behind her bedroom curtains. Doors would open and close softly. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, echoed in the silence. The next morning she would emerge serene, collected, glowing faintly as though the night had given her something she'd long been denied. This was not love in any gentle sense. It was control, domination, and the intoxication of forbidden power. For the first time in her life, Margaret could command without consequence. She could summon a man, someone the law said was less than human, and he would have no choice but to obey. And yet, behind that authority was something more complex, more dangerous. A need. A hunger not merely of the body but of the spirit for freedom and rebellion in a world that had always denied her both. In those quiet, candle-lit nights, she found herself entangled in the very system that enslaved others. Every act of intimacy was laced with the cruelty of imbalance. The men she summoned could not refuse her. To resist her wishes was to risk punishment, or worse. Their strength, which she admired, only emphasized her own dominance. She mistook control for affection, command for closeness. The thrill of power became her secret escape from the loneliness of widowhood, and in that shadowed space, desire twisted itself into something unrecognizable. But forbidden things never remain buried for long. The whispers began small, servants gossiping under their breath, overseers exchanging knowing looks. Neighbours noticed how often she dismissed her staff, how often she travelled alone to the quarters. They began to wonder what really happened behind those tall white columns of her mansion when the night swallowed the fields. Southern society was built upon silence, but silence is fragile when weighed down with sin. Margaret was not the only widow whose grief had turned into something darker. Across the South, women in her position, newly free, newly powerful, walk the same narrow line between loneliness and desire. Historians like Elizabeth Fox Genovese later described it as the paradox of the Southern mistress, a woman oppressed by patriarchy, yet complicit in the oppression of others. Margaret's story was not unique. It was simply one of the few that dared to be imagined. By day, she maintained the appearance of the perfect Southern lady, polite, refined, charitable. But when night fell, her world changed. Behind the heavy drapes and locked doors, she became something the world would never forgive if it knew. A woman who used her power to cross every line drawn by her society. She felt both liberated and cursed by her desires. What she took in secret became her own form of rebellion, yet it chained her to guilt she could not name. In the mirror she saw the contradiction of her existence, the delicate face of a widow, the eyes of a ruler, and the shadow of a sinner. She was both master and prisoner, powerful and powerless at once. Every night she tried to command her own freedom through the domination of another, and every morning she awoke to the reminder that she lived in a world built on cruelty, silence, and lies. History would later forget her name, as it forgot the names of so many women like her. The records spoke of their estates, their wealth, their mourning, but not of the secrets that pulsed beneath those plantation walls. Yet those secrets remain, whispered through time, buried beneath the sugar fields and cotton rows where power and desire once met under the cover of darkness. When a widow like Margaret inherited a plantation, she also inherited a world built on secrets. The fields whispered of pain, the walls held stories that could never be told. To live among them was to breathe in both luxury and rot, to understand that beneath the white columns and polished floors, every breath of air carried the scent of control. For women like her, freedom was not clean. It was soaked in contradiction. She had escaped the rule of one man only to discover a darker rule within herself. The South called it refinement. History would later call it power without mercy. The city's gossip continued to circle her estate like vultures. Neighbours wondered why she had not remarried. Suitors came and went, men of influence who offered protection, companionship, and the promise of restoring her to the proper place a woman was meant to hold. But she refused them all with quiet grace, claiming she wished to remain devoted to her late husband's memory. In truth, she had no desire to belong to another man. She had found her own form of dominion. She was mistress now, not just of the land, but of everything within its borders. Yet within that dominion she felt a strange divide, a hunger and a guilt intertwined so deeply that they became indistinguishable. At night, the air inside her chamber was heavy with the ghosts of her own choices. She had turned her loneliness into command, her grief into possession. The same walls that once confined her as a wife now concealed her as something else entirely. There was no husband to interrupt her, no patriarch to condemn her. The only witnesses to her secret world were the very men she ruled. Historians like Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers and Catherine Clinton later unearthed evidence of this hidden hierarchy, of white women who, after the deaths of their husbands, took over plantations and began to blur the line between ownership and obsession. They found letters, records, testimonies, fragments of a truth too scandalous to be written openly. These widows were expected to uphold purity, to preserve the illusion of moral superiority that white womanhood represented in the slaveholding South. But beneath that image, behind closed doors, they acted out the very impulses their society denied them. Margaret's encounters became a ritual of control. She learned to move through the nights like a ghost, her steps measured, her commands soft but absolute. The men she summoned knew the rules, speak little, obey always. The air in her chambers was thick with unspoken fear, yet to the world outside she remained the perfect example of Southern virtue. She hosted gatherings for churchwomen, donated to orphan funds, wrote letters about faith and grief. It was the performance of innocence, and she played it flawlessly. But in the dark, the masks fell away. There, stripped of etiquette and expectation, Margaret sought what she could never find in the drawing rooms of Charleston or Savannah, a sense of power that was entirely her own. The thrill of crossing the line that every Southern woman was warned never to approach consumed her. The forbidden had become her comfort, yet every act left her hollow, and every morning she stared into her mirror, unable to tell whether she was empowered or enslaved by her own desires. For the enslaved men, it was a living nightmare, a quiet violence that had no name. They could not fight back, for to refuse a mistress was to invite death. They bore the weight of her desires as they bore the weight of the field's labour, silently, endlessly, without hope of release. What the world might have called pleasure was, for them, another form of bondage. They became the keepers of her secrets, trapped in a silence that history would never record. The plantation, with its moonlit corridors and endless shadows, became a symbol of that silence. Servants learned not to ask questions. Overseers pretended not to see. The system itself was built to protect her. White men who suspected the truth looked away, for to acknowledge such transgressions would mean acknowledging that the purity of their own race, so fiercely defended in public, was an illusion. In the twisted order of the South, a white man could do as he pleased with a black woman, but the idea of a white woman crossing that same boundary was unthinkable, and so it was simply never spoken of. Among her peers there was an unspoken understanding, a code of silence maintained by fear, pride, and hypocrisy. Other widows lived the same way. They too acquired young, strong men and brought them close to their estates under the guise of domestic service. They too found solace in power disguised as passion. Sometimes they shared knowing glances at gatherings, a flicker of recognition that passed between them like smoke. No words were exchanged, for words were dangerous. Silence was safer. Silence was survival. As years passed, Margaret aged gracefully, her wealth untouched, her secret world intact. The fields continued to yield their profits, the city continued to whisper, but none could prove what truly went on within her walls. Her beauty softened, but her authority only grew sharper, colder. She became a myth among the servants, a figure both feared and pitied. They said her heart had turned to stone long ago, that she slept in the same bed where her husband died, surrounded by ghosts she had made herself. When emancipation finally came, the old order crumbled, and the Bellemere plantations fell into decline. The slaves were freed, the overseers left, and the grandeur of the house began to decay. Margaret remained alone, her fortune fading, her secrets rotting quietly beneath the floors. The men who had once been her instruments of power disappeared into freedom, leaving her with nothing but the memory of what she had done. The silence that had once protected her now consumed her. Historians rarely mention her kind. The records of such women were deliberately buried under the weight of propriety and shame. Society chose to forget that in the twisted machinery of slavery, white women were not merely victims of patriarchy, but active participants in its cruelties. Their hands, too, were stained, not only with the blood of those they owned, but with the darker sins that could not be confessed. The legacy of the plantation mistress was rewritten to preserve the illusion of innocence, but beneath every history rewritten by victors lies the truth whispered by the oppressed. Margaret's story, like many others, was never written in the ledgers or family records. It survived only in the shadows of memory, in the knowing eyes of those who once served her, in the uneasy hush that fell whenever her name was mentioned. She died as she lived, in silence, surrounded by wealth that could no longer buy her peace. And when her estate was finally sold, no one spoke of what had happened behind those doors. The house was repainted, the walls repaired, the past buried beneath layers of whitewash, both literal and moral. But history has a way of remembering what people try to forget. Beneath the romance of the antebellum South lies the truth of its women. Women who ruled in silence, who wielded desire as a weapon, who found in the suffering of others a reflection of their own fractured freedom. Theirs was a dominion built not only on slavery but on secrecy, where the boundaries between love, control and cruelty dissolved into one. In the end, the story of Margaret Bellemere is not just one woman's fall. It is the story of an era, of a civilization that dressed its sins in lace and called them virtue, that taught its daughters to weep in public and to sin in private, that built its wealth on silence and its morality on lies. And though centuries have passed, the echo of that silence still lingers, haunting the soil where the cotton once grew, whispering of the forbidden domain that history tried and failed to erase. The past does not die. It lingers in the soil, in the ruins of old plantation houses, in the bloodlines of those who survived. What happened in the shadows of the South was not only the story of slavery, it was the story of power, of forbidden hunger, of human desire twisted by dominance. Men were chained by iron, women were chained by expectation. And sometimes, when both tried to break free, their rebellion took forms too dark for history to admit. For every widow like Margaret, there were countless others, unwritten, unnamed, who ruled their silent kingdoms with trembling hands. They lived behind masks of mourning, moving through candlelit halls where the only witnesses to their sins were the walls themselves. Time buried their confessions and history painted them as saints, but the truth cannot be buried forever. It breathes in the forgotten records, in the pages of Catherine Clinton and Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, in the memories that refuse to fade. The plantations are gone now. Their fields have turned to dust, their mansions to relics. But the silence remains, the same silence that kept so many voices unheard, so many truths untold. And when you listen closely to the wind that passes through the South, it still carries the echo